Hello, can somebody verify you can hear me?
We can hear you.
Thank
I
you.
can hear you.
Thank you. All right, before we begin, are there any questions? Not hearing anything. Let me share my screen. Should be seeing my screen now. Come on, someplace down here. So today is August 27th, and we should be in our last week. We should be starting chapter 14. Did we finish chapter 13? Does anyone remember? Let me look into that. I think I did talk about viroids. So let me check and see if we started chapter 14. Uh-huh. I've got a mark that we had talked about latent disease and herd immunity. Is that correct? Come on. I'm not hearing anything, so I'm going to assume that's correct. So when we're talking about diseases, they go through a normal pattern of sequence of events. So normally a disease follows a specific sequence of events associated with an infection by a microbe. First, the disease has to come from a reservoir. So a reservoir must exist. The pathogen must be transmitted to a susceptible host, otherwise you don't get disease. The pathogen then invades the host and multiplies within the host. The pathogen then injures the host. If there is no injury to the host, you have no signs or symptoms of disease. So you may have the disease carrying organism, and it may even be growing in you, but if it's not causing any injury, then you'll have no signs and symptoms of disease. And we call that an asymptomatic patient, somebody who's carrying the microbe, but they don't even know they have it, and they can spread it to others, and they're an asymptomatic patient because the pathogen is not injuring the host. So to get a sign or symptom of disease, you need some injury to the host. The illness will then end when the host immune system destroys the pathogen or the pathogen kills the host. Any question about that? Like with colds and the flus, for example, most people, your host immune system will throw it off, and that will end the disease. But like HIV, especially in the old days, before the advent of modern medicine, HIV would kill the patient. Any question about any of that? So there are some predisposing factors that make the body more susceptible to getting a disease, and therefore this can affect the occurrence of the disease. For example, females have a shorter urethra, and therefore they have a higher incidence of a bladder infection or urinary tract infection. There are certain inherited traits, such as sickle cell anemia gene, making a patient more susceptible to getting many other diseases. Another thing which isn't exactly inherited is diabetes. If you have that disease, you're more likely to come down with another disease. Climate and weather are well known to be predisposing factors. Everybody knows that colds and flus are more likely to spread in the wintertime. And this is not just because we're around people who are sick and then we close up our windows and we're indoors a lot more because of the cold weather. It is also because there's less UV light in the wintertime, killing off the viruses. With the flu, that virus is also stabilized in the colder weather, so the flu virus is more likely to survive and stay around in the colder weather. Any question about that? Fatigue is more likely to make you predisposed to getting disease. And college students often are fatigued, predisposing them to getting another disease. What happens is when you're tired, your body immune system is just not up to its full strength, and therefore you're more likely to get a disease. Age, it's well known that age can predispose an individual to getting a disease. With most diseases, let me see if I can show this here. With most diseases, it's when we look at the incidence of disease and then I guess the age on the x-axis. So this would be somebody's age down here. Oop, guess I'll make that capital. And then this would be the incidence of disease on the y-axis. For most diseases, the incidence of getting a disease is it happens in the very young, and then the teenagers, young adults, very low incidence, and then it increases with increasing age. So this would be something like colds and flus. Most common diseases follow this distribution. The very young, more likely to get disease, and then the very old. Now, with some diseases like COVID-19, we do see a little bit of a blip, meaning newborns much more likely to get COVID-19. And then it drops very rapidly and then stays very low. And then we have this real increase in the elderly. So COVID-19, much greater risk if you're elderly than if you're young. You're only really at a greater risk if you're newborn. And then if you're even a few months old, I don't know when it is, 3 months, 6 months, your risk becomes very low. And it's very low for young children, meaning a normal, I don't know what you call it, normal child, like 8, 9, 10, something like that. And then teenage years, very young. Young adult, also very low. As I've mentioned before, about 50% of children and 50% of teenagers and young adults will be asymptomatic for COVID-19 infection. And then when you get middle age, past middle age, the risk for COVID-19 infection goes up, as well as the severity of the disease going up. Any question about that? So COVID-19 is an unusual disease because it's more likely to hit the elderly. But most diseases follow this normal pattern. Did I spell that right? Probably not. Diseases. Got that twice, don't I?
Makes me feel better about my spelling.
Okay. Lifestyle can also predispose an individual. It's well known that smokers are more likely to get a respiratory disease than non-smokers. And that's because smoking damages the mucous membranes of the respiratory system. And so they're more likely to get a respiratory disease. Chemotherapy is more likely to predispose a patient to getting an illness. Chemotherapy will weaken your immune system as well as maybe weaken your mucous membranes. Any question about some of these predisposing factors making you more likely to get a disease? All right. So when we're talking about a disease, it's important to realize that disease tends to follow a certain pattern of development. Once the host defenses are breached, disease development follows a certain sequence. The sequence tends to be similar for both acute and chronic diseases. First, we have an incubation period. The incubation period is when the patient first becomes infected till the time when the patient first has signs or symptoms. This is called the incubation period. So the patient has the disease organism, but they have no signs or symptoms of disease. The disease is actually incubating in the patient. Let me blow this up so you can see it better. And the number of infective microbes is increasing. And this is just time from the onset of when the patient first gets infected. And this is both the increase in the number of microbes as well as the severity of the signs or symptoms. So initially, when you're in incubation period, no signs or symptoms, but the number of organisms are increasing. Then you pass a threshold where the number of organisms now cause signs and symptoms, and that we call the prodromal period, when the signs and symptoms are mild. Like when you first come down with a sore throat, you'll ask the question, geez, do I have a sore throat? And you have to think about it. And you say, yeah, I've got a sore throat. I'm coming down with a sore throat. Hopefully it doesn't get much worse. I must have picked up something. Prodromal period. That's followed by the period of illness where you no longer have to think about it. Your signs and symptoms are no longer mild. You have full illness where the signs and symptoms are the most severe. Period of illness. That's followed by the period of decline where the signs and symptoms start decreasing. Like when the patient has a fever, that's the period of illness. And then when the period of the fever breaks, that starts the period of decline. So in the period of decline, the number of microbes also decrease normally. That's period followed by the period of convalescence. That's when the number of infective microbes right here, come on, mouse, decreases below a threshold. And now the microbes give you no signs or symptoms of disease. Period of convalescence. You still have the microbes in you. You are still infective, but they're below a threshold. You have no longer any signs or symptoms of disease. And then that will be followed by the where you kick off the disease, where you have no signs or symptoms of disease. You now have no longer any microbes, and you're then cured at that point. Any question about any of that? Now, in some diseases, there is no prodromal period. Like I've been walking around feeling fine, and then all of a sudden it feels like somebody hit me with a sledgehammer. Sometimes the flu has no prodromal period. You'll be in the incubation period, and then you move to the period of illness. And then there are some diseases where there is no period of decline or period of convalescence, such as in the old days where HIV gave the patient AIDS, and then the patient died. There was no period of decline or period of convalescence. Any question about any of that? All right, well, here's the question for you. During which period of illness are you not infective to another person?
Period of convalescence.
Period of convalescence. That's a good guess. Do you have another guess?
Incubation.
Period of decline? Anyone else?
Incubation.
Incubation. Actually, the only correct answer is very early in the incubation period. You are not infected, but that's very, very early in the incubation period. Late in the incubation period, you are infective. In the prodromal period, you are infective. Period of illness, of course, you're infective. Period of decline, you are infective. And the period of convalescence, you are infective. So in all of these periods, you are infective. This was a little bit of a trick question, but I just wanted to ask it because my mother always told me, "Oh, I'm getting better now. I'm no longer infective." And I would tell her, "Mother, you're talking to a microbiologist. I know better." So in all of the periods, you are infective. In fact, for the colds and the flus, and many other common illnesses like colds and flus, your adults are most infective late in the incubation period and in the prodromal period. It turns out with adults in the period of illness, the immune system is working. And so in the period of illness, for many illnesses like colds and flus, you are actually less infective in the period of illness than you are late in the incubation period and the prodromal period. I think this goes back to our caveman ancestors, where the adults were trying to protect their children from the illness. And what happens is the immune system is ramped up and hitting the organism, making it less infective. Only adults do this. Children do not. So the children are infective late in the incubation, in the prodromal, the period of illness, and the period of decline. And it's because they don't care about their parents. That's just being a little bit sarcastic, but that's the way it actually is. Children, for whatever reason, their immune system does not hit the disease, at least in the period of illness. And actually, when I was a boy, I think I was 12 or 13, I was not allowed into the hospital to see my brother who got into a bike car accident. He was on a bike, actually it was a motorcycle, because they said I was a young child. They didn't want me entering the hospital. However, nowadays, most hospitals realize the importance of like grandparents seeing their grandchildren, and so they allow them into the hospital. But when I was a boy, I was not allowed into the hospital because they knew that children were more likely to spread disease than an adult, at least in the period of illness. Any question about any of that?
I don't have a question, but the NICU department also does not allow kids into the hospital.
What was that again? I didn't quite hear it.
The NICU department, neonatal intensive care.
Okay, we don't
Yeah, they don't
children
allow it.
into it. Yes, and that's because, like I said, they are more infective, and during the period of illness, of course, they don't have an immune system hitting the disease. And then also with children, like with COVID-19, they're likely to be asymptomatic, at least 50% of them asymptomatic. And then the neonatal, they're at greater risk. If you remember, I tried to show that. For many diseases, the very young are at great risk for getting a disease, the very young and the very elderly. For most diseases, that happens. Not COVID-19, though. All right, so let's talk a little bit about the spread of infection. There has to be a reservoir of an infection. A reservoir is a source of the disease-carrying organism. There are continual sources of disease. They can be living or non-living. Humans are reservoirs of disease. For some diseases, humans are the only reservoir, like HIV and AIDS or gonorrhea. Humans are the only known reservoir. It is true that HIV can spread to one species of chimpanzee, but I don't know if a human can get the disease from the chimp. They normally do not. There can be carriers of disease, and they will be inapparent infections. And then there can be also patients who have a latent disease. They're carrying the disease-carrying organism, although they are not usually infective when the patient is in the latent stage of the disease, meaning for a budding virus, the virus has to be actively budding for the virus to be communicable. While the virus is actually in the latent period of disease, it cannot be spread. Animals can be reservoirs of disease. For some diseases like rabies and Lyme disease, animals are the only reservoir of disease. We call zoonoses animal diseases that can be transmitted to humans. So zoonoses are a disease that comes from an animal but can be transmitted to a human. A rabies would be a good example of a zoonoses because rabies only comes from an animal. A human who gets rabies cannot spread the disease to another human. Any question about any of that? And I guess if you get Lyme disease, you can't spread it to another human. You would need to be bitten by a tick, and then that tick would need to bite somebody else for the disease to spread from you to another person. And that means that they got it from the tick. Any question about any of that? And then there can be non-living reservoirs of disease. For example, botulism and tetanus are normally coming from a non-living reservoir. And this can be from soil, like botulism, stepping on a nail. And that's not botulism, sorry, tetanus. Botulism would be eating canned food, and it's been picked, and so they consider it non-living. But water and lettuce are two examples of non-living reservoir. The lettuce has been picked, and technically it's still alive because we don't eat when the cells are dead. That would be wilted lettuce or something like that. But they call it non-living because they picked the lettuce. In third world countries, water is a real source, a real reservoir of disease because the water may be contaminated. In the first world countries, water usually is not a source of disease. Any question about any of that? Of course, in the first world country, lettuce is definitely a source of disease. There's always cases of disease being spread by lettuce or spinach or some vegetable like that is not cooked. Because if you cook the lettuce, that would usually kill the disease-carrying organism. Any question about reservoirs of infection? All right. So there has to be transmission of disease before the patient can get sick. There are three principal routes by which the causative agent of disease can be transmitted from the reservoir infection to a susceptible host. There's contact transmission, and that can be direct contact transmission, like hand to hand on a handshake. Vehicle transmission, that's where an object or a fomite carries the disease from a source of the reservoir of disease to a healthy patient. Like somebody who's sick drinks out of a cup, and then somebody else drinks out of that cup. Vector transmission is where an insect or an animal transmits the disease from the reservoir to the healthy patient. Like a rabid cat can bite a healthy individual, or malaria can be picked up by a mosquito biting an infected person, and then the mosquito bites a healthy individual, spreading the malaria. That's vector transmission. Any question about any of that? So vehicle, usually an object or a fomite transmits the disease, and a vector transmission is usually an animal or an insect transmitting the disease. Contact transmission, there are 3 types of contact transmission. There's direct, indirect, and droplet transmission. Direct transmission is person-to-person transmission, requiring close association between an infected individual and a susceptible host, such as when somebody coughs into their hand and then shakes their hand. And then usually what happens is the person who's the susceptible host carries the disease organism from their hand and inoculates a mucous membrane in their face. Direct person-to-person transmission. Like an adult kissing a child can also spread disease direct between an infected individual and a susceptible host. Indirect transmission is where the disease-carrying organism is spread from the reservoir on a non-living object. We call that a fomite. So a fomite is just a word for a non-living object. For example, when somebody sneezes on their hands and then touches a doorknob, the doorknob is the fomite. Somebody else can then touch the doorknob, and then they have to inoculate their hands to their mucous membrane in their face. But the point is the doorknob can be a fomite. Somebody who's sick can either cough on money or cough on their hands and then touch money. And then the money can be the fomite. And then they pay for something. And then the checker gives you that dollar bill. You put the dollar bill in your wallet, you touch your hands, and then you scratch a mucous membrane in your face, or you rub your eyes, your mouth or something. Droplet transmission is via airborne droplets that travel less than 1 meter. That is considered contact transmission. I'm not going to talk much about droplet transmission, and I won't hold you responsible to it. Let me show you a picture right here. Let me blow that up. So right there is about the distinction. On this side would be droplet transmission. On this side would be airborne transmission. This is a little bit arbitrary. It is true that you're more likely to get infected within 1 meter of a sneeze because there's more particles, but you can be infected from the same sneeze beyond 1 meter, and that is not considered droplet transmission. And like I said, this 1 meter is kind of arbitrary, and that's why I'm not going to hold you to it, because I think it's a little bit arbitrary distinction. It's the same sneeze. And a droplet transmission is considered contact transmission, direct, indirect, the baseball carrying it, and then droplet. And then beyond the 1 meter is not considered contact transmission or droplet transmission, it's considered airborne transmission, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. Any question about any of that? So up to 1 meter is droplet transmission. Vehicle transmission normally is where the transmission occurs by an inanimate object, a fomite. You can also get the vehicle transmission by eating food or drinking water or possibly body fluids. And then vehicle transmission by airborne transmission. So whenever you sneeze, if it's beyond 1 meter, that's not droplet transmission, it's airborne transmission. And it's not contact transmission, it is vehicle transmission. And like I said, this is a little bit arbitrary, and that's why I'm not going to hold you for knowing the difference between airborne transmission and droplet transmission. In my opinion, it's still the same sneeze. You can be infected from the sneeze if you're within 1 meter or beyond 1 meter. Any question about that? So let's talk a little bit more about vehicle transmission. So if somebody were to be sick and they drink out of a cup, and then somebody else drinks out of a cup, that would be vehicle transmission. You can also get waterborne transmission, like in third world countries. Contamination by sewage of the drinking water causes a lot of waterborne transmission. This is very rare in first world countries. Foodborne transmission, you always have to wonder about the person serving you or the person handling the food in the kitchen. In theory, if they're sick, they should not be working in the food industry. They should be taking time off. However, that means usually they don't get paid. So oftentimes they will take medication and then work. And then if they touch food, it can get on the food, causing foodborne transmission. Now, if they touch food and then the food is cooked, and then that's served to you, that usually kills the disease. However, if they touch the food after it's cooked, it would be foodborne transmission. And in the fast food industry, they especially tell you if you're sick, you should not be working. Any question about any of that?
I have a question. What is the difference between the indirect contact and vehicle transmission? Because they seem similar.
That's a good question. Indirect would be on the baseball. I'm going to have to say I'm not real sure here. Baseball is a vehicle right here. So it is a fomite. Let me go back here. Yeah, that's showing you indirect contact by a vehicle, meaning a cup.
So is the difference maybe that the indirect contact is when somebody touches something and then you touch it and get the microbe that way, as opposed to the vehicle transmission, it's transmitted first to the water or food or air?
This is a good question. I'm not really sure because obviously indirect transmission, let's say the pitcher is sick, touches the baseball. Now the catcher touches the baseball, he picks it up, and this is considered indirect transmission, but contact transmission. So yeah, indirect transmission is where there is contact between the pitcher and the catcher, but it's by a fomite.
Okay, so
And
like
the
somebody,
vehicle transmission, it may not be so direct, meaning that somebody can touch the cup, but I don't know, somebody else touches the cup, but it gets in the water. I'm not sure. Okay. It's not
Okay.
direct with vehicle transmission,
okay,
whereas with indirect, it is directly coming from the pitcher to the catcher, and the baseball is the vehicle in between. In vehicle transmission, it's not so direct. And I don't know how to explain it exactly, but it's not one person touching the cup and then another person touching the cup and picking up the disease. Does that make sense?
yeah, I think so.
It's being transmitted by the vehicle, but it's not direct from one person to another person, which is what's happening in indirect contact transmission.
Okay,
Okay. Like, for example, I gave you the example of the foodborne transmission. Um, that is actually pretty direct, where the cook is sick, touches the hamburger, the outside of the hamburger. You don't cook the bun, for example, and it's getting on the food. And then the other person eats the food, picks up the disease. This is considered foodborne transmission, which is vehicle transmission. And I guess the food is not considered an inanimate object because we don't eat inanimate objects. It's food. Okay. And so you're right, there's a little bit it's a little bit arbitrary, I guess, between vehicle transmission and indirect transmission. And with indirect transmission, there's very close association between the sick individual and the susceptible host. And there's only one object in between. And with vehicle transmission, there can be multiple objects in between. For example, you could, for example, touch the ketchup then is put on the hamburger, and then the patient eats the hamburger. So that's two objects in between the two people, the reservoir and the susceptible host. Any question about that? Plus, you have to eat the food too. It's more than just contacting the food. All right, that's a good question. I've never been asked that question, and that stumps me because indirect is very close to vehicle.
it seems like maybe vehicle is more
It's
like
not so
diluted.
direct.
It's
Indirect, there's only one object in between the catcher and the pitcher.
right.
Okay.
Can I
Okay.
say something? The CDC, when she asked that question, I was curious. The CDC says that vehicle transmission is one of 3 indirect transmissions.
Okay, yeah, these are all indirect.
Yeah.
Waterborne, foodborne, airborne.
Yep.
Yeah. All right, let's go on to vector transmission. Vector is where an animal carries the disease to the susceptible host. The most important group of vectors are the biting arthropods, especially fleas, ticks, mosquitoes. Transmission can happen in 2 ways. They can be mechanical transmission, like the fly here, picking up the disease-carrying organism passively on its feet. The fly then lands on the food, passively transmitting the disease to the food, and then the food is consumed by the susceptible host, picking up the disease-carrying organism. So the passive transport is considered mechanical transmission. Any question about that? The other way disease can be transmitted is by biological transmission, And here, the pathogen actually reproduces inside the vector. For example, malaria being picked up by a mosquito biting a infected human with malaria, the malaria grows within the mosquito, and then the mosquito bites the next human, infecting the susceptible human, and that's biological transmission. Any question about that? Anyways, that's vector transmission where the disease is spread by an animal. Another good example of vector transmission is rabies. As I mentioned, humans can only get rabies from being bitten by an animal. What happens is rabies, when it infects a human, humans do not get the rabies virus in our saliva. Humans also don't have the urge to bite another person, but even if they did, they would not transmit the disease. So rabies is actually a dead end for the virus when a human gets infected. It's a dead end for the virus. Any question about any of that? All right, if not, let's talk about nosocomial infections. Nosocomial infections are also called healthcare acquired infections. They are an infection a patient gets from a healthcare facility, a disease that the patient did not have before going into the healthcare facility, and then they only get it from the healthcare facility. So if they never went into the healthcare facility, they would have never gotten the nosocomial infections. This is one of the most important topics you can learn in microbiology, assuming you are going to work in a healthcare industry. What is a nosocomial infection, and how can I prevent them? Any question about any of that? Nosocomial infections are hospital-acquired infections that are acquired from the result of a hospital stay. The disease-carrying organism was not present or incubated at the time of admission. The patient only gets it from being in the hospital or healthcare facility. It's estimated that 5 to 15% of all hospital patients in the United States acquire a nosocomial infection each year. This is 2 million people per year, or 20,000 deaths alone each year in the United States, getting a nosocomial infection. It used to be the 8th leading cause of death in the United States. It may be bumped to the 9th leading cause now that COVID-19 is around. I haven't looked that up. It used to be the 8th leading cause of death in the United States. Any question about any of that? Nosocomial infection happens because what happened there? There we go. About 1 out of 10 hospital patients gets a nosocomial infection each year. 50% of nosocomial infections are preventable. You don't need to know specifically the numbers here, but you should know that there's a large total cost in the United States from nosocomial infections. And in 2013, it was estimated to be $9.8 billion in the United States alone. Nosocomial infections result from the interaction of 3 factors happening when the patient checks himself into a healthcare facility. And that could be a hospital, a nursing home, a rejuvenation center, or maybe just a health clinic where you're actually there for maybe just a couple of hours. Hospitals are a major reservoir of disease, Microorganisms are present in the hospital environment. Obviously, sick patients are in the hospital for a reason, and they have microbes. Some nosocomial infections are normal microbiota that become opportunistic pathogens. And then to make matters worse, some nosocomial pathogens are antibiotic resistant. So microorganisms are present in the hospital environment. Obviously, there are sick patients. And then just in the air, there's microbes in the air too. That can be a nosocomial infective agent. And then the patients coming into the hospital or healthcare facility are often compromised hosts, one whose resistance to infection is impaired, either by disease, therapy, or by burns. Broken skin or mucous membranes compromises the host, making an infection more likely. Burns, injections, ventilators, urinary catheters, administration of anesthesia, all weaken the host, making the infection more likely. And then the patient could be having a suppressed immune system, compromising the host. This can be from drugs suppressing the immune system, radiation therapy, or burns. All of these weaken the host immune system, making the patient more susceptible to getting a nosocomial infection. So the patients are often compromised in the hospital or hospital-like setting, and they're more likely to get a nosocomial infection. And then in the hospital, there is a chain of transmission. The principal routes of transmission can be direct contact transmission, and that could be patient to patient. In special care units, hospital staff are trained to prevent disease from moving from patient to patient. There can be also direct contact transmission from hospital staff. Well, let's say from patient to hospital staff to patient. Take a look at, well, I guess I'll talk about that later in the indirect transmission. Indirect contact transmission. This happens via fomites. Urinary and IV catheters can sometimes indirectly transmit a nosocomial infection. Contaminated surgical dressings can transmit an infection. Why? Obviously, you should handle dressing appropriately. And obviously, urinary and IV catheters should be handled appropriately also. But take a look at the old medical movies. The doctor will proudly wear his stethoscope around his neck, and he will listen to the patient's heart, touching the stethoscope to the patient's skin. And then what did he do? He just dropped it, thumped it on his chest, and then moved on to the next patient, taking the stethoscope and putting it against the patient's skin to listen to their heart. That was indirect contact transmission, possibly spreading nosocomial infective agents. And in the 1950s and 60s, this was one of the major ways that nosocomial infective agents were spread, indirectly by a fomite, something like a stethoscope. The medical profession quickly learned that stethoscopes were transmitting nosocomial infective agents, and by the 1970s, they started cleaning the stethoscope so that it wouldn't spread from patient to patient. So in the 1970s, the hospital staff started becoming educated and started less transmitting nosocomial infective. In the 1980s, they started educating the hospital patients and the hospital visitors. And now you go into a hospital, you can find a sign up in the elevator outside the patient's room shortly after you walk into the hospital, prevent disease. And then you'll have this hand sanitizer and something like sterilize your hands or sanitize your hands. So almost all hospitals have hand sanitizer outside of every patient's room, as well as in the elevator and usually when you just walk into the hospital. So we've become much better educating the hospital staff, the patients, and the visitors. What we're trying to do is prevent the spread of a nosocomial infective agent. Any question about any of that? All right. Obviously, direct contact transmission could happen from somebody who's visiting. They don't sterilize their hand and then they shake hands with the hospital patient. All right, then there can be vehicle transmission, such as airborne transmission, like in the ventilation system, spreading disease. This can actually happen with colds and flus in hospitals. We don't really have a good way of doing that. I think in like maybe some ICUs, they actually do sterilize the air and send it through a filter. But in most air in the hospital, it doesn't go through a filter. And so it can spread disease. There was concern when people came back from Africa and they had Ebola. There was actually concern that Ebola might be spread in the hospital by the ventilation system. And they did look into that. And I think they decided that Ebola is not likely to be spread by the ventilation system. But I think what they did was, with the Ebola patients in the United States, they put them in a specific room. If there wasn't a filter, that air in the room was not recirculated, wasn't put into the ventilation system. Any question about any of that? So these are the three reasons why nosocomial infective agents are likely to happen in the hospital. Microorganisms are present. The patient is compromised. That's why they're going into the hospital setting or the hospital-like setting. And then there's a chain of transmission. How do we control nosocomial infections? There are certain procedures that are generally implemented to control nosocomial infections. You've learned aseptic technique now in microbiology. When you go into the healthcare setting, always apply aseptic technique. You should be proper handling contaminated materials so that the contamination doesn't touch something else and then spread that way. You should have frequent and thorough hand washing while you're in the hospital-like setting. It's been shown that if the staff simply has frequent and thorough hand washing, they will reduce the spread of nosocomial infections by about 50%. And then the staff, the patients, and the visitors are now all educated, and the goal is to educate everyone and then reduce the spread of a nosocomial infection. There are many other things you can implement to reduce the spread of a nosocomial infection. If you're curious, take a look at my online chapter notes, and they talk about some of the other ways to reduce the spread of a nosocomial infective agent. Obviously, if you're sick, you should wear a mask or not be in the hospital at all. All right, any question about nosocomial infection? These are also called hospital-acquired infections, diseases that the patient gets while they are in the hospital, that if they never were in the hospital or healthcare facility, they would have never gotten that disease. And sometimes, like I said, if the patient is really under stress, the nosocomial infective agent can kill them. That's especially true for a drug-resistant nosocomial infective agent. For example, the patient gets a nosocomial infective agent, the doctor prescribes the primary antibiotic for the agent, and it doesn't work, and so the doctor switches to a second agent and then does a test to find out which agent can work. And before the test results come back, the patient is dead because the second antibiotic didn't work. Any question about any of that? All right. Let's turn and talk a little bit about epidemiology. Epidemiology is the study of where and when disease occur and how diseases are transmitted in populations. The CDC collects and analyzes U.S. epidemiological information, and then it publishes this information in the Morbidity and Mortality Weekly Report, which is usually called the MMWR, and you can find it at www.cdc.gov. It used to be a link on the first page, easily found. Now, if you go to the CDC, it's not so easy to find. You got to look around on your page. Let me go here. I don't even know if I can find it right away. Well, actually, let's just do a search. Home page for the MMWR. That worked. Anyways, latest reports. Where am I? Here we go. Notifiable diseases are those that physicians are required by law to report. Usually, what a physician and somebody who's reporting a disease will first send it to the county health facilities, which I don't even know where that is in Clark County. I knew where it was in Washington County when I lived in Washington County. You sent it to the health facilities in Hillsborough, which is just where the capital, Washington County, is. And I imagine it's someplace in Vancouver, but I don't know. And Vancouver then sends it to the state health facility, which, does anybody know where that is in Washington? I'm sorry, I'm recently an immigrant to the state of Washington, so I don't know the specifics for the state of Washington. In Oregon, which I used to live, it would be sent from the state, the local counties to the state health facility, and that is in Salem, Oregon. But in Washington, I don't know if it's in Olympia, the capital, Washington, or if it's in Seattle, the largest city, or some other place. Does anybody know? Where's the state health facilities for the state of Washington? Nobody knows. Okay. Anyways, and then the state sends it to the CDC. The CDC compiles it, breaks it down into morbidity and mortality. Mortality is if the patient dies, morbidity if the patient gets sick, and then publishes it weekly in the MMWR. So each week, the MMWR comes out at the CDC. Any question about any of that? All right. Two terms you should know for epidemiology: morbidity is the incidence of a specific notifiable disease. The morbidity rate, the number of people affected in relation to the total population in a given time period. So morbidity would be the total incidence of something like COVID-19. Mortality is the deaths from a notifiable disease. The mortality rate, the number of deaths from a disease in relation to the population in a given time. Any question about morbidity, incidence of a disease, mortality, the deaths from a specific disease. All right, if not, that's it for this chapter. I think we are all done. On Thursday, I'll be giving a review for the final. Let me remind you, the worksheet for chapter 14 is due today, 8/27. And the unknown notes closes today also. So this will be your last time for asking for a test. August 27th. The unknown project, the report is due Wednesday, August 28th. There is no lab today, but at 7 o'clock, I'll be logging in for 15 minutes to answer any questions. Oops, wait a minute. I got the final on the 29th. Oops, sorry, in the summer, this is going to be a little different. Actually, I'll give the review in the lab today because there is no Thursday. I was thinking the final was next week, but that doesn't happen in the summer. The final is Thursday, August 29th. And then the Canvas course will close September 4th. Any questions about anything?
When should we expect a grade for the infectious disease paper?
I'm not sure. That project takes a long time and I haven't gotten started on it. As I stated, there are 2 projects that'll take me a long time to get graded. I wish I could say I would have it before you have the final, but I'm still working on the labs. I will get the labs done first, and then I'll start the infectious disease paper. I don't know when I will get all of them graded, but I won't post the grades until I have them all graded. So I'll do my best, but I can't guarantee it'll be done before the 29th. Sorry.
It's okay, thank you.
All right. Any questions?
So you're doing the review tonight during lab,
I'm
correct?
doing the review tonight
Okay.
during lab. Yes.
Perfect.
All right.
Thank you.
All right. Bye.
Will you be recording the review and posting
Yes.
it
Yes.
as usual? Okay.
Yes.
And can you also make the PowerPoint slides available for all the chapters?
Yes.
I think 13 and 14 are
14.
missing,
All right. I'll do
if
that
I
right
remember
now.
right. Okay,
Okay.
great. Thank you.
All right.